Product managers have done a really wonderful job of being a team that is there to deeply understand a really complicated problem. In HR, you're understanding a very complicated problem. You're basically responsible for end-to-end understanding how all of the human beings in that business work and are effective to producing whatever it is that your company's there to do, your mission, right? That's a complicated thing to understand. Product managers are fantastic at influencing and rallying other people around the things that they need to get done. If you build an influence and you have a deep understanding of a business, you can then drive forward positive behaviors rather than having to facilitate control by putting blockers and hand slapping and HR bottlenecks in place in order to maintain that.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. I'm very proud to announce I recently had an article published in the Harvard Business Review. So, Work for Humans is getting a big influx of new listeners. To give them the best possible introduction to the show, for the next couple of months, I'll be revisiting a past episode like this one that was both popular when it was released and supports the points made in the article. Don't worry, new episodes will appear on Tuesdays as usual. The philosophy behind our way of managing people predates most of the tools we use. In fact, they predate most of the people who work in our companies. But a lot has changed in the last 30 years. We have new business models, new technical capabilities, and new market forces that are changing what people expect from work. But how we think about work and how we think about the workforce has evolved very little. In today's episode, I talk with Jessica Zwaan, who's on a mission to revolutionize the employee experience by changing the philosophy of people operations. Heads up, this is a pretty wonkish episode. Jessica and I geek out pretty hard on the operations part of HR. Jessica is an author, speaker, and early-stage startup executive. She's the current Chief Operating Officer at Whereby and former COO advisor for clients like Soundcloud, Talentful, and Bolt, among others. Her latest book, Built for People, helps teach organizations and leadership how to transform the employee experience using product management principles. In this episode, Jessica and I talk about the distinctions between people operations and human operations, viewing work as a subscription product, and value versus volume when it comes to employees. We also talk about what people want out of work, tracking employee cost versus employee value, two maxims of product management that apply to HR and other topics. All right, when you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Jessica Zwaan. Jessica Zwaan, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to talk to you today, Dot.
I'm excited to talk to you. The reason is, I feel like you and I are like intellectual doppelgangers. Like we have followed similar paths. We've come to similar understandings of work. The words you use, when I read your words, I'm like, I know those words.
I wrote those words in my soul.
I know, exactly. It's like over and over again, I see similarities. And so on this show, a lot of times what I do is I bring very different perspectives onto the topic of work. And the show is about bridging those perspectives. But in this particular case, I think we're going to have a really rich conversation about nuanced differences between our perspectives, because otherwise it's a show about us agreeing the whole time. And that wouldn't be very interesting. So how do you summarize your perspective on how we should be doing work better?
I have written a book about this topic. It's called Built for People. And it takes the idea that every business is building three products, whether you like it or not. You're building one product you sell to your customers, and that is razors, if you're Harry's Razors, or it's real estate, you're selling a house, like it's whatever you're selling to customers, right? That product almost can't be avoided. Everybody knows that product. The second product you're building is actually a financial instrument. Your company does actually exist. This sometimes invisible layer of customers in VCs or shareholders or the private equity market, or even if you're a bootstrapped founder, you're your own customer. You're building this financial instrument for yourself. The third product is actually the employee experience. And I say that your employees are customers of a subscription product. They sign up to every single month. And at the end of that period of time that they would like to stop working with you, they hand in their resignation and terminate their subscription. So if you take that frame of mind, first of all, is these three products are deeply connected and beneficial to each other. The better quality investment you get in the marketplace, if you're in VC capital land like I am, means that you're going to have better quality people on your board. You may get a bit more PR. You probably have better cash. You have better terms. Means you can hire people on maybe higher salaries. You can offer them better benefits, and it's a bit of prestige for working with you, which in turn means you can build a great product. Now, if you build a great product, hopefully your customers love it, and then it reciprocates back with more cash that you can go get more investment. So there's this very mutual beneficial system that exists there. And if you treat your employees with that level of commerciality and really think about this as a subscription product, I actually think that people operations teams are some of the most important teams in terms of how we build that experience in a really unique way, just like we build our products to stand out in the marketplace, but also just how commercial that role actually is.
It's interesting that you and I have come to such similar, again, those words, it's remarkable. It's also interesting how you and I both come from a similar background, which is operations close to people operations, either directly in or adjacent to. What is your background?
I didn't study HR or anything at school. I actually studied law, so I have a law degree. I never really, I think a lot of HR people say this, but I never really meant to get into HR. But I did work in HR for a very long time in my career, but I was always more on the operational end of that work than on the, I guess, like the kind of typical Ulrich model centers of excellence type person. I was never really aligned with any of that kind of thinking. And I started working more and more broadly, and now I'm the chief operating officer of a tech startup here in New York.
And so as a chief operating officer, you have all aspects of operations. You have sales operations, you have all of these different pieces. And so you're coming from an overarching now operations perspective. You make a distinction between two different things, people operations and human operations. What is the difference between those two things?
So this is going to deviate a little bit, but I wrote this blog in 2020, right, which ended up turning into my book. Very super proud of the work, love what it was. But I wrote the blog I'd been working this way for a while. I'd been doing a bit of consulting, and I had a founder who was like, you should write about this way that you approach things. I think it would be really interesting. And I kind of just did it on a weekend, sent this blog out into the world. And I didn't really spend much time thinking about, the terminology I used, what would happen if people started picking me up and asking questions about it. So I picked these two names, people ops and human ops, thinking, well, it's a simple little blog post and helps people understand. Now, years later, and a book under my belt, and multiple people to ask me about this on a kind of pretty regular basis. This is actually the first time I've ever really spoken about this. I actually really don't like that these are the names that I've decided to give it, because I feel like it makes it very confusing.
Well, then let's not talk about them.
But I still agree.
Let's not use those.
Yeah, I don't know what maybe you can help me rename them with something better. But the reason I find it hard is because I think it actually confuses people. But basically, if you're a people person, and that's people or talent, you have two sides of the role that you do. One side is what I've called human ops, which I think it's a slightly confusing name when we're talking about people ops, but basically that is the qualitative work you do on a day-to-day basis. So no algorithm yet, hopefully, can replace that. And that is advising people on difficult circumstances, or speaking to people if I have to give feedback to somebody that's going to struggle with the feedback, or reviewing CVs and really trying to understand the nuanced details about why someone might be a good hire, right? That's work that needs to happen on a daily basis and highly qualitative. You get a lot of information from it. Then your other half of your role is people operations, which is essentially a product manager. So that is the time you're spending building, iterating on, and improving that subscription product that I described in the first answer I gave. And ideally, what you're doing is you're pulling really valuable insights from the qualitative work that you're doing, combining it with the quantitative insights you're getting from your HR system or your data platform, whatever you're using, and putting those two things together and saying, this is the problem we need to tackle, this is the product we need to build, and then going out with your team and doing that.
So you talk about the commerciality of people operations, I think, is the way that sentence is finished. So what do you mean when you say the commerciality of that part of the business? On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, three-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company, Talentful, to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management. On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, three-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company, Talentful, to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management.
So in your company's P&L, in my P&L that I have in my team at Whereby, headcount is about 60% of our monthly spend. We've got about a 60% headcount OPEX split. Then we have the people budget, which is comprised of a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of SaaS in there that we're using to kind of monitor and look after our team. There's benefits, there's events and engagement programs that we run, a bunch of stuff, right? So those two things combined, your OPEX budget and the fact that you are there to essentially optimize 60% of your company's spend and de-risk that investment, means to me that your people operations team is actually the team that runs the largest investment budget in your entire company. Like nothing comes close. Even marketing, maybe I think some of the biggest marketing teams are maybe 10% of the budget.
Yes. And this is where we can compare and contrast a little bit. I agree with that. So keep going, because I'll tell you that I take it from a cost perspective, but also from a value perspective, which is how much value is the workforce bringing into the organization as compared to other parts of the business. And so you've got this very large percentage of your investment, and people operations should be in the business of optimizing that investment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, right? I think for a very long time, maybe I lean more in towards talking about the investment because it's such a clear and firm figure. Whereas I've found in my history that people operations teams talk a lot about maximizing the value you're getting out of your people. And for various reasons, maybe some of them systemic, I've rarely found a people person that's really good at actually being able to not only estimate, but track and forecast. Like, what actually is that value that I'm able to move with my programs, my activities that I'm doing? And you see that when like times get tough and teams shrink their budgets, and then all of a sudden people can still produce the same amount of work. It's like, well, why were we investing in all of this stuff? People teams struggle very much with having this correlative relationship between the work they're doing and the value that they're producing. I believe it's there 100%. But when I'm speaking to, a CEO or another COO, the language of investment is so much clearer to them because of the fact you can track it.
I find that very persuasive, what you just said. And I've always felt like HR organizations create a very tortured path trying to connect the experience of the workforce to profit. And if you look at the studies, they're really not good. They're not good. And it's like this multi-step thing. And when it comes time to actually invest in the people experience, everybody's like, look, that's a 5-step causality thing that you have to prove to me. And I don't believe it. Look, I can just cut costs right over here. And that's 100% obvious. So I agree with that. I'll tell you how I've solved it. Not perfect, which is you take your operating margin. Let's say for every dollar that you invest in your company, you make $1.25. And you just multiply that by the 60% of your company that is that cost. And what you come up with is really what the value of the workforce is. Is it perfect? No, it probably underestimates it because none of your other operating budget is actually making decisions. And so the quality of the decisions of the workforce is so important that it's probably more than this. But if you do this in the companies that I've been, it's usually the second largest product as a line of business. If you say work is a product that we're selling, that people are subscribing to, what's the value of it? Compare it to your other lines of business. At Cisco Systems, it was equal to all of our sales to Europe and Asia in terms of value.
Wow. It's really interesting. I don't know if you've seen this, but I shared this little framework I built around building an employee lifetime value to CAC ratio. And I think your description of value actually is way better than the way I've done it. I want to go and rechange it. But basically what I've done is I've said, over the course of time, how much does it cost to employ your person on average? So say you've got 20 months tenure, your average salary is $10,000 a month, your average fully loaded cost is X, and then your HR budget distributed across all of your headcount is Y. So add all those things up. How much does it cost to recruit? Whatever. How much is your HR team? Is a fully loaded budget. Split it across everyone, and it is $175,000 to have one person employed by your team. Well, what is the lifetime value? The terrible way that I've calculated it right now, and I think your way is actually much better, is I just take the ARR and I divide it by a head. It's like simple ARR per head metric, right? And the reason I try to use that value is I really do think it's probably one of the only ways that you can really show some kind of causality between the investments you're making in people to either extend your tenure or improve the relationship between your number of heads and the value you're getting into the amount you're investing into them in your HR programs to your revenue. If you see revenue go up when you're making these changes to those levers, there's some argument that the people team was able to influence that.
Yeah. I'll tell you my struggle with always looking in the year and why I hesitate to do it is that if you look at a company that's successful, how much of its success are people who aren't even there anymore? All of the intellectual capital, all of the intellectual property of that function may have been generated 10 years ago. You don't know. It's a real struggle.
That's a good point.
What is ARR?
Annual recurring revenue or annual received revenue, depending on what type of business you have.
Annual recurring revenue. Okay, yeah. I mean, it works way better, I think, when your company is a subscription on the other side, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
How does people, and now I'm hesitating to say people operations, but I actually mean people operations. What needs to be built out in terms of people operations to make a better product that people can subscribe to?
I get asked this question a lot, and I really think that, I really do think that, like, the Ulrich model was invented in like 1995, which is older than most people that are working in some of these startups. So the way that we're doing business is definitely older than our tools, older than some of the team, And that's, I don't want to be super biased and say just because a way of working is kind of old means it's bad per se. But there's a philosophy associated with the Ulrich model that existed in a time where we didn't even have cloud platforms to help us do our work, let alone AI as facilitated ways of working. And the practice of people operations has moved on so much, even in the last 15 years that I've been working. But the philosophy hasn't changed. The way that our mind is in terms of HR, it has not moved beyond these PeopleSoft, very clunky HR systems. We're scanning documents, we're about compliance. We're not that world anymore. So I think the first thing that really does need to change is honestly, there's not much more beyond the mindset, in my opinion. Once you adopt a mindset of moving into this space, the natural next step is now, I think, in output metrics and trying to inform behaviors and incentivize behaviors rather than stop people from doing things or prohibit certain outcomes. I'm not thinking in terms of we ship this thing in the dark anymore. I'm starting to think about how do I engage with people and build user-friendly pieces of work that have user research behind them? How do I think about my position in the marketplace as needing to be unique in order to attract the right strategic people rather than needing to be homogenous because I need to ship an EVP, right? And I think just that philosophical change, it starts to trigger dominoes, all of the things that operationally need to happen because they become necessary. I don't know if that's too of an airy-fairy answer.
No. I mean, not to me, but I want to tell everybody what the Ulrich model is for people who don't know. HR used to be a somewhat non-differentiated mass of people who were responsible for personnel. What that meant was that HR was sort of in the helper business directly to employees, but was really not a strategic team at all. Well, what Ulrich realized is that HR could be a strategic organization if it really understood where the business was going in terms of the workforce. And what that would mean is that you'd have to break that homogenous organization into several pieces. You need to break the organization into several pieces, partially from a money perspective, which is that you need to create a team that's going to face directly to leadership and is going to understand the strategic goals of leadership and translate those into talent requirements. Well, where do you get the money to do that? You do that by taking the other piece of HR, which is employee facing, and making that cost effective. So what you're going to do is that's the scaled services of your organization. And you make that as automated as you can. You outsource potentially the people who are doing that work so that you can afford to have this leadership facing function, this consulting function. What that does, though, is it takes HR and it says, your path to fame and fortune and power is to do exactly what leadership wants. And so it way pushes the signal that's coming into HR into the perspective of leadership. And the perspective of leadership is that employees are an input to production that need to be purchased and used. And that's not a moral failing. That's just distance. They have to think that way because they're very far away from the problem space. And it starts to ignore that employees want more than just being bought. So that's my summary. What do you think, Jessica? Is that a reasonable?
That's a great summary. I really love the additional extension into what that behaviorally means for HR. And I think this is kind of almost exactly why my answer is about the philosophy and the way that we do the work needs to change, because it then drives us. It shifts the whole set of behaviors and the outcomes in a way that it's not visible to you when you're doing it because it's so innate. Do you know what I mean? It's this relationship between you're listening to leaders tell you that people are just numbers. Okay, great. Well, that's how I need to behave. It's hard to question that when this is the way you've been brought up in your job. It's the way that everyone around you operates. And it's the way that you get told is how your function effectively runs and pleases the business.
Right. And after 20 years, more than 20 years of the Ulrich model, we have evolved an HR leadership that is entirely formed by that mental model. And what it means is that, like any dominant paradigm, we've built university programs that are going to generate people who think that way. We've created journals and organizations like SHRM, which are designed to teach people to think that way. It's a very dominant and very hard to displace self-reinforcing system.
Yeah, it really is. It's so funny. Like, actually, a couple of months ago, I was in London doing an event for my book, and someone asked me, how do I convince my CEO that I should do this model of working? Because it means, some shifts potentially in your organizational design. It definitely means a shift in the way that you're thinking about things with leadership and how you're talking about the work that you're doing. You stop doing things in these long waterfall like blocks and start being much more iterative. So the work may look sloppier at first. You need to have leadership buy-in. I really do believe that. And my take on it was actually that I have not really ever had a CEO or COO or CFO or whatever else in the C-suite turn around and say to me, I don't think this makes any sense, or I would not agree with my team doing this model, or I don't think HR are ultimately responsible for looking after this investment. Every C-suite person that I've tried to explain this model to is like, that makes a lot of sense. We agree. This is great, fully supportive. The places I get the most resistance are HRDs, chief people officers, and VP people who really don't like the ideas that massively challenge the way that they have built their hierarchy and their team, the kind of power dichotomies that exist in HR, which aren't always healthy to the team, and definitely not actually, I think, healthy for the HR team either. I think that's why so many HR teams end up feeling this kind of internal flagellation about being the cops at work. Like, this comes from this same system, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's where I see the most resistance, actually.
That's really very interesting.
Why do we think that HR, you might know this better than I, I've been thinking this for a while, right? Like, for a very long time, I've heard in lots of different spaces that, HR really wants a seat at the table. I believe really strongly that HR's never had any reason to not be able to see this perspective or see a perspective like this perspective and take that opportunity. There's a huge amount of budget they look after. There's a huge amount of value people produce for a company, even if it is just, they don't see themselves as managing this investment. They just see themselves as being the kind of administrative, I guess, in that typical Ulrich model, right? Speaking to the leaders and looking after a large administrative workforce, that's still quite a powerful role within an organization. So why do you think that is it a symbiotic relationship with HR and leadership that allows this to exist? Like, why does this perpetuate?
There's a couple of things. One is, if you ever want to read something about how HR works, read The Courtier, which is a book written in the 16th century, I believe, on how to survive in the court, which is that the way power flows through HR is by how much you satisfy the parts of the company that produce P&L. And so even if the leaders of those organizations are wrong, you're going to do what makes sense to them because that's how power is allocated and money. But there's another thing, which is, in my opinion, because we have always seen employees as an input to production who are being acquired, we've turned to tools from psychology, and it's all been a focus on how do I get the most out of this asset. And what you've done and what I'm doing is to change that to say, no, work is a product that we're selling. Yes, the people we get is super important, but let's stop talking about how we're going to extract value from the workforce. Let's also talk about the product that we're actually selling to that population. That's not a skill set that HR has traditionally had. But I do think that if you were to position HR in that role, that product of work, the value of it is what I was calculating before. What is the value of the market for the product work that we're selling? And that would raise HR to a real seat at the table, because now you may not have a P&L, but you have a VNL, which it's a value and loss statement, where you are one of the customer-facing leaders, just like every other major leader in the company, as opposed to being a servant or a courtier to those other parts of the organization.
Interesting. I love a value and loss statement. How do you imagine it existing?
I don't know.
I'd love to try and build one. Wouldn't that be fun?
I know. We should think about how we're going to do that. In fact, it's true for P&Ls too, which is that we know the L is in this year, but we don't know where the P is. We know the profit is in this year, but we don't know the connection between the investment and the profit. It's not in the year. So VNL suffers the same problem, which is that the causation between the two, or the relationship between the two, is not directly causal.
Yeah, there's some kind of lag, right? I think there's probably something that, it's really interesting. There's this activity that I do with usually kind of pretty early stage startup founders when they're starting to think about their org design. And I ask them to plot their team or their ideal team basically on a little chart. And I said, do you want this team to be high value? So essentially be able to contribute large amounts of value. So they have very high influence over the work that you're doing versus high volume. So if you want really high value employees at a really high volume, we're talking you want to build a company like Facebook, like Google, where you've got these really, really top of their game individuals. You're going to be paying a lot of money and you're going to need a lot of them. That's where you want to be. Or you can be super high value, super low volume. You're maybe a deep mind or somewhere building some really niche protein creation science startup. Or you can go really high volume, really low influence or low power, low value, however you want to describe it. And that is like maybe an Amazon logistics warehouse. And companies will be all in that different spectrum. And there's a strategic reason why you may want to be somewhere in that spectrum. Now, it's my hypothesis that probably the higher value impact that your team has, and definitely the lower volume, I imagine, probably the longer lag time between your creation of work and the value derived. You probably have a longer LTV to CAC payback ratio.
Interesting. That's a really good point.
Because if you're hiring at really, really high volume, presumably, maybe there are edge cases, but you're probably not going to be hiring at super high volume. You wouldn't be able to handle the amount of turnover and tenure that like high volume teams require, that you'd be able to have a really long payback period. So it's probably a smaller lag.
What's funny is that we're asking more of the VNL than we actually are asking from the PNL.
True.
But I think it's a really important thing to do is to get serious about that and to say, for instance, your investment in the workforce is going to have a very long burn. One of the things I say to leaders is I say, look, this is the only part of your company that makes decisions about your business is the people. And I said, lots of companies have foundered because of the accumulation of those decisions. You should probably invest in that capability, right? It's one of those invisible failures. Why does the company's profit gone down? Well, somebody made a lot of decisions back there that are not adding up. So in your work, what do people want to subscribe to, in your opinion? In other words, what's the product that they want?
I think there is an element of it is different for different people, but I'm sure in marketing, you've probably seen those like 3 circles that expand beyond. You've got the core product, an actual product, and then your augmented product on the outside, right? The core product, in my opinion, it is just a job. It is something to do because you need that relationship between you're selling your labor for cash. That's the job. Then the next layer out is the actual product, and that is the packaging that goes around that job. And I think for a lot of people, that might actually be where what they want ends. And that is good pay, good statutory benefits, the holiday, what you're getting contractually. That's that kind of actual product, the actual specifics of the employment. Then there are the people that the augmented product is what really matters. And I think there are a lot of people out there, especially probably in the world that we spend our time in, where the mission, the sense of purpose that they have in the world, the fact that they can go out and proudly talk about what they do, the fact that they're solving difficult problems, that augmented product, there are a bunch of different things that different people want. But I think what we're kind of talking about is there are some people out there that probably want an actual product and a good actual product. You want a car that works, you can kick the wheels and you can chuck your stuff in the back. And there are some people that want a SUV or they want a Ferrari or they want a Jeep. And those are 2 different people you're speaking to. And I spend a lot of my time consulting and dealing with the second group, the people that really care about this augmented product, where work has some deeper connection to them that goes beyond just the contract and the benefits.
That's a model I wasn't aware of. So that's a super valuable model.
Well, thank you.
I'll tell you how that's coming out in my work. Do you know Joe Pine's work, The Experience Economy?
No.
It's really changed the course of my research.
We're getting so many books to read, by the way.
I know. I get to read a lot of books to do the show, but I hadn't spoken to Joe Pine until I interviewed him. And what he points out is that the whole economy, I have to stop talking about this on the show because my listeners are going to get tired of it. I'll say it one more time. The whole economy follows a progression of economic value, and that the base component of the progression of economic value is goods. And then after goods, and let's say if it's coffee, it's a coffee beans, it's just a commodity. Goods to products. Now it's ground coffee that you can buy, it's prepared for you. And then it's a service, which is you can get a brewed cup of coffee and somebody will give it to you hot. And then it's an experience, which is that cup of coffee in a really nice coffee shop with jazz and good Wi-Fi and nice furniture. And then ultimately there's the transformation economy. Well, products like coffee, the business of coffee is pulled up that series through the economy. It's pulled there by margin because you can sell a coffee bean for a lot more money, like 10x or 20x, if you're wrapping it in an experience. And that is also being pulled up by competition. And so what you're talking about as the augmented part of this product, the commoditized part of this product is the pay and the benefits. And in fact, companies even benchmark to make sure that we're essentially paying the same amount or close to and providing the same services at that level. But the differentiated part of the product is up in the experiences. And a lot of work is going there. And a lot of the friction we feel and the unhappiness of people working is they're getting the commodity part, but they're not getting the experience part.
Interesting. I really like that framing. And I think there probably is a relationship between the fact that teams haven't been thinking about their experience as a product with the fact so many people are in products that they don't enjoy. Because I actually think what it's ended up with is this kind of world in which we have built these very homogenous cultures because we feel that's what everybody wants. Like everybody wants the same augmented product. Everybody wants the same coffee bean in the same cafe in the same cup with the same barista. But the reality is actually some people want something wildly different than somebody else. Like, I worked at Goldman Sachs and I sometimes have people when I speak to them and they've never worked at Goldman and they're like, oh my gosh, you worked at Goldman? Like shocked and scared about that fact. I'm really proud to have worked there. So there's nothing in there for me. But one of the things I think is really interesting about what they have managed to do, they have made their brand, what it is like to be a recipient of a Goldman's product or a customer of Goldman's product from an employee, so specific, so clear, and so well shared that people that have never or will never work at Goldman Sachs know exactly why they're not going to do it. And people that want to work at Goldman Sachs, they want to work at Goldman Sachs, right? And they are there, they're in, and they've got their own agenda. Maybe they want to be there for a year, maybe they want to be there forever. I don't know. But I have to respect the fact that they have been so deliberate about being like, if you don't like this product, we don't really care. That's a good thing for us.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's a couple of different things. As you go out toward the experience economy, what people want diversifies. And so that's what happens out there in the experience economy is that there's a diversification. I would also think with Goldman Sachs, I'd be curious to know if they are also billing themselves as part of the transformation economy. The transformation economy is someplace you go, and at the end of the day, you're the product. In the transformation economy, if you go get an MBA or if you go to the gym or something like that, the way you know it's working is you're different.
Got it. I love that.
And did they have that? Like, yeah, man, this is going to be horrible, but you're going to be better for it or something like that.
Yeah, hell yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely spot on. I think actually there are some workplaces that, really do step into that, and some that the closest they get to it is saying, you'll be changed because you'll want to put our name in your Twitter bio. And it's like, okay. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that's 100% how far they've gone into it. They believe that if you come and work at Goldman, you will come out of it a different, better, ostensibly person because of the experience of working there. And people really subscribe to that.
And what's interesting about that is that the farther you get out, the more co-created it is. You are not transformed by others. You participate in your own transformation. Were you transformed by Goldman Sachs?
I actually think I really was. I think a lot of the thinking that I've come out with today is because of the time I spent there. It was the first time I ever had a strat in the HR team, which was like a mind-blowing thing to me. The fact that we had this developer analysts sitting there extracting, transforming, and presenting data to us in these crazy models. That made me think like, there's really more to this than the way that it has been taught in my first couple of years of employment. So yeah, I think it has.
Was it hard? The experience of being transformed?
It's hard to pull apart the difficulty of, I think maybe this is by design within the transformation description. I'm not sure, but Goldman's culture is known for being hard, right? That's the thing, Is it hard because it transforms you, or is it hard because that's a product decision that they've made that they think is good for them? Or is it both? Maybe it's symbiotic. I'm not sure. I don't know if I was transformed by the hardness necessarily, but maybe products of the hardness were the things that transformed me in a good way. So products of the hardness is they're an incredibly quantitative business that, of course, is going to put a strat in the HR team. Now, that means that the team has to be rigorously measured, really, really on their numbers. You have to be a numbers person if you work there, in my opinion. And then the outcome of that is you learn an awful lot. It was great for me. So I can't really say that I don't think they're hard for hard's sake. Maybe it's actually part of the transformation, or maybe it actually is to facilitate that transformation. I'm not sure.
Which, whether it's hard for hard's sake or hard on purpose, it's still a feature of the product that you purchased.
Yeah. But I think there are different ways to get to that same. I mean, there are, how many ways can you get to an outcome? This is one of the things I was actually speaking to somebody today where I'm running a 6-week course on the book and talking to a bunch of HR leaders and some COOs on the course as well, which is great. And one of the people asked me a question today we were talking about holiday booking, quite an operational little problem. A lot of people in a team booking holiday at the same time. How do you solve that problem? Kind of an easy little way to describe some methodology, right? And talking a bit through some practical bits of it, somebody said to me, well, if you implemented this solution you suggested, then surely it would just upset XYZ, or surely these parents wouldn't like ABC. And I'm like, how would you approach that? How would you fix that? And I said, well, the solution is you go away and do user research and you come up with your own solution. The difference, I think, in the way that this people ops as a product methodology kind of translates itself in HR work is gone are the days that something you say, well, you solve that problem by implementing this process or implementing this tool or going out and getting this policy. Instead, it's go and find out what the problem is and how you uniquely solve it. And there are millions of ways to do it. And I can give you some ideas about paths you could walk. But if you just copy what I say, then you're ignoring your users. And that's a real problem.
I could not agree more with that. I could not agree more. It's like, now that you're in the paradigm shifting business, how's it going? What are the resistances? What's the pull?
Yeah. Speaking to founders, C-suite, senior people in businesses outside of HR, I find the conversations enriching, motivating, really interesting. And I am loving having these really exciting and energizing conversations with people who have thought about something one way for a really long time. And then we leave a conversation and they're like, I've never thought about that way before. I feel great. I'm going to do something. I'm going to take action. And I genuinely believe this is going to improve people's working lives. So that makes me really happy. There is resistance, like I said, in the HR functions sometimes with folks. And I think that comes, from the historical protection. We spoke a little bit about the structures in which build that resistance, I think. The other thing that I have found is more when I'm operating with it, it's less describing this mindset to someone, very supportive. There's been a couple of times when I've been operating with this mindset, whether I'm, doing some consulting work or working in a business that I haven't worked in before, advising somebody directly to their CFO. And I will sometimes get this, well, that's not your job. That's not what you're here to do. You're not here to ask about the P&L. You're not here to get involved in building this thing. I find that really interesting. It's a great idea in theory for some folks, but when it actually comes to practice and it means that, HR starts poking around in other people's areas and asking why we're doing something a certain way, because technically all of the way that everybody works then becomes the product, right? And that becomes a little prickly. People love the idea before they start realizing, well, wait a second, that means you're going to tell me that I have to tell my team to do why. I'm not sure about that.
Oh, no, that's a super, super important point. It's the point of, yeah, talk, but don't mess with my business. And it's like, this is not your place, HR. to actually tell me how to run my business. That resistance is going to be huge.
I don't really know if there's anything else you can do but be resilient to that and demonstrate the value. Like, this is the thing. It's like these kinds of transformations and changes take years. They take multiple people in senior positions and operating positions talking about this, doing this work. For me to believe that I'm going to just start working with people or advising somebody, and then next week they're going to turn around and say, we reshuffled our entire org design because you gave us some great advice. I have recognized that even if I just get one person to crack open one brain cell of change about how they think about something, that's actually already a massive win, because so much of this is institutionalized, right? And it's not just institutionalized in HR teams, it's institutionalized in all of the teams around them, because HR teams are really core teams in describing and curating how businesses are run, even if it isn't with this commercial mindset. They're the ones kind of building the policies and frameworks. They are the ones that ultimately are operating a lot of this work, that then that work has to go somewhere. This is one of the things in my methodology I talk about is I've got two maxims of product management that I basically tell HR people I have to think about. One is to do everything in the service of the mission. So if your company sells sweaters for cats, don't go out and say we're going to start building cat pottery. Like, that's not what we're doing. We're doing cat sweaters, right? So if your business is really, really caring about getting these high leverage people with PhDs to come and work for you and engage them, and they're from a certain demographic, don't go out and start saying that the HR team wants to do a beer round ping pong Fridays for all. Like, it's not the same thing. You can't do those two things if it's not going to work. So don't start building structures that don't align with your company's mission. And the second thing is to achieve everything through others. And this is the one that upsets people. People love, like, oh yeah, do everything in service of the mission. Great. Achieve everything through others. And what that means is gone are the days where HR builds a policy or a framework or a tool, and then it is also our job to turn the machinery and crank the wheels of that tool. No, it is a tool for management. It is a tool for leadership. Leadership are the ones that are ultimately responsible for managing teams, not people. And I think that is actually one of the things that frustrates people the most is I now say, my people team will not be the people team that runs your performance assessment discussions. Well, who's going to do it then? That's you.
Right. There's some things I want to unpack there. First of all, the cat sweaters. Love cat sweaters. The idea is to build operations that support the end customer, right? That support delivering to the end customer what you really want to deliver. I position employees as customers like you do. And so now we have to talk about the work product and making sure that the work product that we are designing and building, that we have a mission for it, that we have a statement. What kind of product is it that we are building? And let's bend everything toward that. The second thing is I had Alex Komorowski on the show. He is the chief strategist for Stripe. But before that, he was the lead product manager for Chrome, Google Maps, a whole bunch of very big platforms. His whole conversation was about how to have influence without direct control. He said, especially as a product manager of a platform, you are not in control. And so you have to develop very indirect tools for kindling a two-sided community. It's all about that.
This is one of the things I love about analogizing people operations, not only the product, like the actual experience to a product, but the way that people operations teams should work to product management functions is product managers have done a really wonderful job of being a team that is there to deeply understand a really complicated problem. If in HR, you're understanding a very complicated problem. You're basically responsible for end-to-end understanding how all of the human beings in that business work and are effective to producing whatever it is that your company's there to do, your mission, right? That's a complicated thing to understand. And I really do believe that people need to understand it. I don't like it when I meet a people person who doesn't know what their EBITDA is or doesn't know what the sales team goals are. Like, I think that's kind of bad practice. Product managers never do that. They know everything about their product backwards and forwards. They know how many users are logging in each day, how many are active, whether they're engaged or disengaged. They get what's going on in their product. Love that. The second thing is they're fantastic at influencing and rallying other people around the things that they need to get done. And, just to your point there, I think that's a thing that people have for too long focused on. How do we slap a hand away from doing something rather than how do we incentivize great behavior and get people moving towards what we need strategically as a business? And I think the third small thing on the same thread is product managers are fantastic at thinking in outputs. How do we use that influence and that understanding to produce an outcome? And that's a thing that people teams, I think, could really learn from. If you build an influence and you have a deep understanding of a business, you can then drive forward positive behaviors rather than having to facilitate control by putting blockers and hand slapping and HR bottlenecks in place in order to maintain that.
By the way, another person I had on the show was Jeff Parker, and he is one of the people who put the math behind multi-sided businesses. And a pipeline business, a one-sided business, is about control, and that's how it scales. But a multi-sided business is about orchestration. And so it is not about control. It's about something else. And that's exactly what you're talking about. What you're talking about there is how the tradition of HR has been one of control. But in a multi-sided business, it can't be. It has to be orchestration. We're both sitting here sort of rubbing our chins and thinking is what we're doing.
It's a very interesting conversation. I feel like it's very, maybe not even refreshing. It's so intellectually fun to chat to you because I spend a lot of time and I love it. So if someone's listening here and like getting offended or upset, like I love talking to people about this idea and getting excited and brainstorming something new with them. I love it, right? But I don't think very often, I think this might actually be the first like really deep conversation I've had with somebody who has already got this whole wealth of their own versions of methodologies they're building and ideas they've had on the same track. And it feels like I'm getting to reevaluate my own positions on things in a way that I don't usually get to.
Yeah, it's because as a paradigm shifter, you're alone.
What does that mean?
A paradigm shifter?
Yeah.
Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Again, something that my listeners may get tired of hearing about. But basically, he said, look, scientific revolutions happen because you keep collecting data, the facts start to not fit anymore. And so that sort of stacks up, and then you get pushed and somebody comes up with a new paradigm, a new theory that describes more of the facts than the old theory. Well, the first thing that happens is they get attacked. And that's because there's this enormous sunk cost in the existing paradigm. University departments, journals, all of that stuff that we were talking about with HR has been built up to support that. And people's entire reputations and everything they've ever said and everything they've ever published is all of a sudden looking obsolete. And so it's a very lonely place to be out there and say, excuse me, plate tectonics. And frequently, the people who say plate tectonics, apparently the person who did that was not actually a geologist. They were something else. So it's frequently somebody outside of the discipline, let's say in operations, who may see a different perspective than somebody who's inside the system, which would be HR. So what happens is you're out there and you have to make everything up from scratch yourself. You can't read a book on it because nobody's ever thought it before.
You have to write a book on it.
And
that's a pain.
Right? And it's hard to get published in journals because all the journals are like, you don't have the credentials to publish in this journal. You're not in whatever the field is, geology. And you sound crazy. I mean, a little bit. You sound like a crank often. Let's take germ theory. Everybody believes in the miasma theory of disease. It comes on the wind and it's a vapor that's coming from the swamp. And you say, no, there's these little animals and they're really small and they live in us. And everybody says, you sound crazy. And so then you run across somebody who says, no, animals, yes, some of them are plants, but yeah.
Okay, so we're two people that are convinced that animals live inside of us in a sea of people that believe crows spread the plague or something.
It's a very different thing.
I love it.
We're not alone.
It makes a lot of sense.
Because there are, and I'm collecting large, more and more groups of them, people who are thinking this way.
Yeah. In a way, I don't think it's a completely new thing. I think that there's been a lot of people, maybe not using this kind of language, but probably shifting into the idea of we should be thinking in outputs, we should be focusing on influence, we shouldn't be building our team, we should be thinking more agile, whatever it is, right? There's versions of this that have been existing for a long time. And then there are also a lot of people that I've met over the course of the last couple of years, and particularly since the book came out, where somebody said, like, oh, I've been building my team in this way, but I've never called it this. Like, I never really knew what to say about it. I just said, like, this is how I feel I should be doing it. And then listening to your podcast or reading something that you wrote made me realize, like, oh, that's what I've been doing my whole career. So I definitely don't think that there's nobody else out there in the world that's doing this. But I think you're right. Like, sometimes it's hard to wade through the sea of other folks that when you say, oh, I think you should be doing this, they respond, well, that will never work.
And there's this other thing, I think, which is that there are a lot of people who instinctively know how important it is to treat people like whole humans, for instance, at work. But it's hard to attract budget. I've probably seen a dozen employee experience teams spun up, lots of fanfare, and then just not get funded. And that's because the structure of the business model, it's that tortured chain of causation that you were talking about. If your argument for budget has to describe a 10-step linkage between employee experience and our profit, that 10 steps is actually a result of a business model that puts the employees a long way away from value. So I would argue that there's a million books and there's tons of academic research that say treating people better is good for business. But when it actually meets a business model that says employees are an input to production, everybody nods their head and says, that's a great idea, but we're going to fund this other thing.
When I wrote the book, I wrote my first chapter. It's quite not a heavy, but a bit of a history of HR, like what led us from the beginning of essentially like the wage girls, I think they were called, or something back in England, all the way through to today. And I even remember writing or reading in one of the chapters about how we realized at a certain point that having people work 23-hour shifts at work was not a good idea. And yet we still haven't managed to learn from those mistakes as we've gone through and said, well, maybe making people unhappy and miserable isn't good for business. We should stop that completely and instead focus on welfare. No, we'll just make them a little less miserable. We'll just chip away at the misery.
Let's stop them from dying because it's causing revolution.
It's bad for the bottom line.
We'll invent HR. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm going to go to one of my closing questions, and it'll probably wrap us back around. Because I believe work is product, I use product marketing tools to understand the product better. And so at the end of the show, I ask some product marketing questions to people who come on the show about their work. So what job do you hire your job to do for you?
I've got 2 jobs. I'm going to say, can I have 2 jobs?
82 jobs.
Great. So the job that I hire, the job of leading the company I work at to do for me, is to connect me with people that are collectively trying to do something good in the world. And we believe it gives me a sense of community. That's the job. I employ it to connect me with those people. The job that the writing and the work that I do, speaking on podcasts and speaking at conferences, does for me is it does the job of making my first job better. I genuinely believe the more people out there that think about this the way that I'm thinking, and the more that I can advocate for that, that job helps make the working life that I have in my day-to-day better because everyone improves.
It's an very, I think, compelling statement that you said. Connect me with people doing something good in the world. And I think it's a compound statement. One is, I don't want to work for a company that's not doing something good in the world. And so knowing that it does something good in the world is important. The second part is connecting me with people, which one way I've heard that said is I hire my job to work with teams. And when I asked why, the person said, to amplify myself.
Ooh.
And so for them, they could work alone, but that wasn't good enough. They also wanted to have a bigger impact.
What's the answer that surprised you the most from someone on that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I've gotten some answers I haven't resolved yet. I mean, there's some pretty weird answers. Like one of them that I tell this story all the time, which is that somebody said to me, I hire my job to pretend. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, I like to go to work and pretend to be a vice president. And I said, you are a vice president. He says, no, man, I'm a jazz musician. He says, but I like to put on a costume and I like to get on stage and I like an adoring audience. And that's what I want from work. But, it surprises you once and then you hear it 5 times. You hear it 10 times after that. I've talked to people all the time who say, yep, that's me. But then there's like one person said, I hire my job to eat only what I kill.
Oh.
What did they mean? They meant they liked to play a serious game. They liked to wager something of importance when they were doing something. This was a consultant who lived by his wits and he needed to make his money every month, but he liked the seriousness of it.
Huh. Interesting.
I talked to somebody who spends 6 months building robots for a one-night party involving robots and people, an event. And what he liked to do, when you asked him about the whole life cycle, he said, I like bringing novices together who don't know how to build robots and bringing everybody up to build robots. And the second thing he says is, I love the cast party. He didn't love the party. He didn't love the event. That wasn't what it was for.
It's kind of amazing.
It's totally amazing. But what you find is that when you ask people what they hire their job to do for them, they often tell you what they are hiring their current job to do for them. And it's sort of a gap in the methodology. But because a lot of us have the same job, I get 30 or 40 of the same answers. But you talk to somebody who has a weird job like that, and they have a very different answer because they are consuming a product that nobody else has ever consumed.
My husband is a video game developer. I'm going to ask him. I think he would have a very different answer than me. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see.
Yes, some people don't want to work with other people. What does your job cost you?
This is a good one. I'm going to answer both of these in the 2, but I don't think I have a. I think for the first one, being in a leadership role in a team of people that rely on your decisions to themselves have security in their lives, there have definitely been times where I was in more pain because of decisions than I could let on or make public because it's inappropriate. If you're a leader, you can't flagellate publicly and I think there is a real personal cost to trying to not allow yourself to become a person that oppresses your own emotional response to the decisions that you're making when you put yourself in this position and you do it because it's better for you or you enjoy it. It's a sense of prestige. I don't know, right? There's reasons why people take leadership roles, and it is difficult to not let yourself be dehumanized by your own sense of professionalism or requirements to be a leader, if that makes sense. So I think there have been times where it has been very difficult for me to not become a person that just oppresses all of the pain or frustration I have about decisions I've made or things that have happened. And then the other job that I do out writing books and being much more public facing, I think the thing that probably cost me is, and this may be a strange answer, it has cost me a lot in terms of the sense of mobility I have in the future, which is going to sound silly, but once you become a person, I think, and maybe this is just me being skeptical, who has a name of speaking about a certain thing, or, I'm not saying that I'm like some big famous person, right? But I do have some kind of presence and people do think about me in a certain way. I don't have an Instagram anymore. And I couldn't just decide like, I'm going to become a ballerina tomorrow. I can't just decide I'm going to quit my job and become a nurse. There is a sense like this sense of this fluidity of my career is much more limited now. There's a sense of sunk cost if I do something wrong, or if I make a statement that's inappropriate or incorrect, or I don't want to stand by later on. I have to be much more cautious, I think, about that. But it also means that I have this sense of I can't just throw it all away and become a chicken farmer. And maybe sometimes I want to be a chicken farmer.
You know what ties those two things together is hostages to fortune.
No, I've got golden handcuffs or something. That sounds awful.
What that means to me is that if you love something, you worry about losing it. And if you feel that way about your team and the decisions you make about your team, their fortunes are relying on you. And the same is true for this idea that you have in the world, which is that you now have to protect it. It also is sort of the cone of opportunity is narrowing because you've made decisions that have given you a brand that you need to continue.
Yeah. Do you ever feel that way? Do you ever feel like becoming like a chicken farmer or throwing it all away and then I couldn't do that?
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem too, is that more and more people start to get involved in what I'm doing, and then I have responsibilities to them. And I should do it now because it's only going to get worse if I'm going to do that. I am 20% in my current job, and I'm 80% outside of my job. So doing this sort of stuff, I could just sit on the beach.
We could.
I could just go fishing. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Well, I don't know either. If you figure it out, let me know. I'm sure we probably have we both have the same disease, whatever it is. The little bugs inside us are wrong.
Yeah, that's true. One of the people who came on the show was Simone Stolzoff, who wrote the book, The Good Enough Job. And his whole book is, your job is not your religion. It's not your family. It's not these things. It's a contractual agreement. You shouldn't overcommit to it because it will hurt you in the long run if you do. And then he went on to say, I can't stop working on everything that I have to do. I'm my own worst boss. And that's because he still has the challenge of needing to work.
Yeah. Funny.
Well, this has been a delight. How can people learn more about you?
I wrote a book called Built for People. So if you're interested in reading it, if you liked our conversation, please do go and read it. I would love that. I also love feedback on it. I really love when people message me on LinkedIn. I don't actually really have any other social media, so just message me on LinkedIn is great. I do have Twitter, but that is becoming a diminishing interest of mine. I'm thinking about closing it down for reasons probably not worth going into. But yeah, probably just LinkedIn, to be honest, or drop me an email. My website has my contact form.
What's your website called?
www.jessicamazwan.com. There we go. Learn your own website before you start pitching it.
Jessica, M-A-E or M-A-Y?
M-A-Y, like the month. Jessica, M-A-Y, Zwaan, Z-W-A-A-N.
Thanks for coming on the show today. I think this is going to be a continuing conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been really, honestly, such a lovely conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.